Okay, well, we can center in on them. That'll be great.
Great. Well, good afternoon, everybody. This is Patrick from the Poison Pen Bookstore in Scottsdale, Arizona, and we're here with another of our virtual events. And today we're delighted to have our friend Martin Edwards back with us to talk about his brand new Lake District murder mystery called The Girl They All Forgot. There's a copy of it right here. Really great cover design.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you.
And I will be monitoring the comments field. So if you have questions for Martin, go ahead and put them in, and Barbara will summon me back on screen towards the end of the hour. So Barbara, over to you.
Thank you, Patrick. Martin, what a pleasure to see you. I'll drink you a little toast and tea this afternoon here.
Thank you, Barbara, and I'll have a glass of water.
Oh, I was hoping you'd have something more sustaining.
After our conversation.
Well, I know the 8-hour time difference means he can drink while I'm drinking tea. In any case, I'm really delighted to see this book, which has been a long time coming. And Martin and I have, in fact, worked on this series since the very first book, The Coffin Trail, for Poison Pen Press. I can't even remember what year The Coffin Trail published, Martin. What was it?
It was 2005, 2006, so quite a while ago.
Okay.
Yeah.
And I recommend this. Martin and I both, great fans of the late Reginald Hill, whose books were superb. And although many of you know them about Delisle in Pasco and, Yorkshire, he actually did write some set in the Lake District.
Yes,
and it's kind of Peter Robinson territory in a way, although, does Peter actually, do you remember, has he actually set a book in the Lake District?
No, I don't think he has. I think he's nearly always in Yorkshire.
I think he has 2 stories to London or something. But anyway, the atmosphere in the Peter Robinson mysteries and the fact that they are police procedurals, which in fact were also true of Delisle and Pasco, although unorthodox would, I guess, be the right word for those. So if you're missing Reg, like I am, and you read Peter, then I can certainly recommend this. So Martin, tell us about the basic cast here: Hannah Scarlett, Daniel Kind. How did you identify these characters and decide to use them in a series?
Well, the genesis, as you were saying, goes back quite a long time now. I'd written one series set in Liverpool with a lawyer character, Harry Devlin, and those murder mysteries were always seen from Harry's point of view. He was a kind of amateur detective as well as a lawyer, and those books are great fun to write. I'm still very, very fond of them, but I wanted to do something different. And I changed publishers, and the new publisher suggested that I write a series with a rural setting. I thought this was a chance to have a series set around a relationship developing rather than just the single protagonist with Harry. So the idea that I came up with, first of all, the setting, the Lake District, which is about an hour or so further north from where I'm talking to you right now in Cheshire. It's about an hour and 10 minutes to get there from here. So quite handy for research purposes. Beautiful part of the world, also a very historic part of the world. People forget that. Literary history and history generally as well, really important in that part of the world. So I was excited by that idea. And the idea of history appealing to me. And so I decided to have a police detective who was a woman who was involved with cold cases, which were quite a new thing in those days, in the early 2000s. So I started writing this about 2003, I think, so nearly 20 years ago, amazingly, as it seems to me now. And the idea was that there would be a developing relationship, and the male character was to be a historian. So Hannah is looking at cases from the past, the historical aspect of crime, and Daniel is by nature a historian. And there is a personal connection between them because Daniel's estranged father was Hannah's boss back in the old days. And the idea was that they would meet during the course of the first novel, which is a book called The Coffin Trail, and that they would solve the mystery together. And they would eventually develop into a personal relationship. Or at the start of the series, they're in relationships with other people. And Hannah's in a relationship with the bookseller of all people, Mark Amos, and Miranda, a journalist, is in a relationship with Daniel. So that was the premise, the setting, and then the characters and the link with history, and that was the driving force behind the Coffin Trail. And a Coffin Trail, for those of you who don't know, it's something that there are a number of them in Britain, and hundreds of years ago, in rural England, when somebody died in a remote valley. And there was no church or burial ground or consecrated ground in that valley. The local villagers would take the deceased person and put that person on the back of a pack horse, and there were trails across the fells, the hills, and those trails would eventually take you to consecrated ground where the burial could take place. And there are still one or two coffin trails about, and there are one or two in the Lake District. So that was the idea, the vision for the first novel. So that was the concept, and that's really where it all began.
Well, one of the great things about the Lake District is that the geography gets to be just as much a character as everyone else. I mean, you can quote Wordsworth, you can think about, is it Beatrice Potter? Isn't she the Lake District?
Yes,
yeah, so we have Peter Rabbit. We have poetry, we have all kinds of things. And I've been to the Lake District, and I can remember driving, and because the roads that I recall, and I think the last time I drove in there, it was like in the mid 1980s. So I have no idea what the roads look like now, but they were very small, barely paved, no verge, whatever. And if you were driving up over a hill, it was as though you were driving right up into the sky. And when you crested the hill, I was never sure in my little car with the, wrong side of the road drive, whether I was going to just like take off into space or crash down, into the fell or into the lake. But it really was very, very rural and remote. The Coffin Trail makes sense. Has it become much more integrated into, now that people can commute long distances or work from home?
Not really, because the geography with all those hills, and although they're not very high, they are quite steep, quite narrow, and the valleys are often quite narrow, most of them. And you've got the lakes. So although the Lake District is actually a small area, certainly in American terms, it's 30 miles by 30 miles, more or less. So they're not very big at all. But it's almost impossible to get around it very quickly, even today, because the roads and the lanes are as you describe, and difficult to navigate. And of course, if someone's coming the other way, that's potentially problematic. So it's still got, even now, in 2022, this very rural and sometimes remote feel, which of course plays very well in a classic style detective story.
Well, it does. I mean, it's a kind of a holiday destination, tramping. The British are great hikers, and there are all kinds of public wayfarers and so forth. So that works out. So when we meet him, he's actually a TV personality of some note. He's been in Oxford. He has a complicated relationship with a woman, actually ultimately sort of a tragic relationship. So he's come up to the Lake District, and he's in an ideal position as a detective because he doesn't actually have a 9-to-5 job. He's working on a book and the whole thing. And so when Hannah Scarlett, who is the policewoman that Martin mentions, he's able to help her without, hugely disrupting his life. But the complication between them is that Daniel had a tough relationship with his father, who left Daniel and his mother for another woman, whereas Hannah has a lot of admiration, maybe even reverence in a way, for Daniel's father. So they come from very different perspectives, but it's the father's work that in the cold cases is very central because he was like a main player, right, in the area.
That's exactly right as you described it, Barbara. And that sort of ghost almost of Ben Kind haunts Hannah to a degree to this day, and that continues to be the case in the new book, The Girl They All Forgot. Ben is a significant background influence, if you like.
Well, they both have personal relationships that we are pretty sure, as we move on, that are eventually going to collapse, and eventually Daniel and Hannah will work out something. Daniel also has a sister whose personal life is a disaster, and so she complicates things as well. And it was very nice of you to give Hannah a bookseller as her kind of main squeeze, but you're able to bring in lots of interesting characters. I have found, I mean, I've loved working with Martin on so many books over the course of the years. You have a slightly Gothic tendency, Martin. And I would say in all of our editorial discussions and so forth, I've always been sort of slightly trying to rein you in. And you've done whatever you wanted to do anyway. But, your mind does sort of spin off into a Gothic sensibility. How would you describe that?
Well, I think you've described the other series I'm working on at the moment, the Rachel Savonate series. You described that as Golden Age Gothic, series set in the 1930s. And I think that's a great description. I was quoting it only yesterday to somebody who's asking me about the books, because I think that is right. And you're right on the general point that this Gothic, slightly macabre element does appeal to me. Of course, Gothic fiction was a kind of ancestor of detective fiction. I've written about it in the New History, The Life of Crime, at some length in the early pages, and it's always interested me. And the idea, we see it in Edgar Allan Poe, we see it in many writers over the years, and I think with fiction, it's very often appealing to let your imagination rip a little bit and to test the boundaries in some way. Of course, this means testing the reader's suspension of disbelief now and then. And I tend to do that more in the 1930s series than I do in the Lake District series, which is rooted in today. So the 1930s series is more Gothic than the Lake series, which is, as you say, it's more of a traditional British rural mystery, but it does have these darker elements every now and then, not in a graphic or explicit way, but in the last book, which goes back seven years now, The Dungeon House. That is a pretty dark book, and that's actually set on the west coast of Cumbria, and a very seriously remote place, a little village called Ravenglass, where Reginald Hill actually used to live. But it was a Roman port 2,000 years ago. It's got a huge amount of history. And it's also got a nuclear power station just along the coast. So it's you've got this strange contrast of ancient and modern there, which is very fascinating and very fertile ground for a writer's imagination, and a crime writer's imagination above all.
Well, The Dungeon House, which was the seventh of the preceding book in this series, was more Gothic, I think, than the other ones. So I wasn't sure which direction you were going to go when we got to this book, which involves a missing person. It involves a strange suicide, somebody walking into a lake and actually drowning themselves. But again, I think almost any Gothic has to have, and you and I have talked about this, it has to have some kind of a structure that, is central and defines it. And so the Dungeon House, clearly that was it. In your Rachel Savonate one, particularly the second book, you have an almost fall of the House of Usher, kind of a thing that happens. In this book, you've got a retirement or sort of assisted living, whatever you want to call it, or maybe it doesn't. I can't remember whether it really provides medical care or whether it's just a luxury retirement.
It's just a luxurious place where people with money, and in the book, the people in question happen to be 40s, 50s predominantly, but it's located in a village called Strandbeck, which is a fictitious village, and located next to the coast, Morecambe Bay, which is just immediately south of the Lake District, where there is a lot of quicksand as well as conventional sand, but it's mainly quicksand. And I've called that little stretch of the coast where the action takes place the Crooked Shore, which doesn't actually exist, but the place, the scenes in the book are very much based on a particular part of that coastline and a particular village which inspired me. I made changes to it to fictionalize it, but it has its roots in reality. And when I was researching for it, and I spent quite a lot of time going around different parts of Cumbria, because each book in the series is set in a different part of the Lake District or Cumbria, the county. And I thought of quite a number of possibilities, and none of them was quite satisfying to me for this particular story idea until I came to this small village on the coast and I saw the signs warning visitors about the dangerous quicksand. And I thought, what happens if somebody walked out onto this apparently very attractive, very beautiful beach and the bay, and then just carries on going until we disappear. And that macabre idea was the starting point for the novel, and it's where the book begins, because a man called Kingsley Melton is sitting on a bench, which is a fictional version of a real life bench by the bay, and somebody goes past him and goes into the bay and is sucked under because those quicksands really are dangerous, and there have been some appalling tragedies in real life there. So that was the idea, and it sprang from a real life location, which I have changed in some respects for the purposes of the novel, but it's essentially a bit of Cumbria that isn't terribly well known, but is certainly very striking. And the minute I saw it, I knew that was the right place for this particular book.
So when we worked on this book together, it was called The Crooked Shore, if I remember, and now it has the title because almost all books today either have girl, wife, mother, sister. It's just this huge sales hook. And so now it's called The Girl They All Forgot, which refers to the missing person whose fate is woven into whose story rather is woven into this whole thing. I myself think if I see one more book with a girl or whatever it is in the title, I'm just going to throw it across the room and move on because I'm so bored with it. But I'm not the sales force of your publisher, so here we are with A Girl They All Forgot. But to my mind, this is actually called The Crooked Shore because I think that the location is so central to the whole development of the story, the isolation, the deadly sands, the lake, and then this strange anomaly of this very high-end leisure complex, and a woman, a widow, very wealthy, who's living there almost on her own because it's been a tough sell due to its remoteness and all. So it's not filled. There are vacancies there, but here she is with this kind of, as the British say, posh, very posh suite. And so a lot of things revolve around her. We can't really tell you much about the story because we'll ruin it, but Martin is really ace at surprises and little twists and so forth. And you have a really good time with that. When you write them, Martin, do you see the way you want the story to end, or do you just work your way along and somehow magically the ending suggests itself?
Well, different methods work for different books, and I try to vary it. So each book, even within the Lake District series, I've tried to write each one a little bit differently. So the Dungeon House was different from the earlier books. You say it was darker, that's for sure. This one, because there'd been quite a gap, so what, 7 years between the Dungeon House and this one. So I wanted to write it differently, and I wanted to use other viewpoints. So the viewpoint of Kingsley, whose character I really enjoyed writing about, this guy who thinks he's very smart but really isn't. Characters like that I really enjoy writing, I must admit. And he's obsessed with this woman, Tori, who's moved into this luxurious block, and he's the person responsible for managing the flat, so he has a way of keeping in touch with her. And then a young handsome man who Kingsley doesn't like comes on the scene and starts to get interested in Tori, and that leads to all kinds of conflicts. Meanwhile, Hannah is exploring the mystery of the suicide, which isn't in itself a puzzle because it's quite clear what has happened, but it's 20 years following the suicide of that man's father, and that man was accused of the murder of Ramona Smith, and Ben Kind was convinced he was guilty, but he was never able to secure a conviction. So the case is reinvestigated by the cold case team, and eventually all these things come together. And when I was writing it, finally to get back to your question, Barbara, when I was writing it, I had a clear idea of the central motive for the major crime, and there's also a significant subplot in this story. But I had a clear idea of the subplot as well. But I knew who had killed whom and why, what had happened. But I wasn't clear about how to get there.
Right.
And so the final stages of writing were quite fresh. I quite like that at this stage of my career, to have some things that aren't really resolved in my mind as I'm writing them, because I like to be excited when I'm writing the later chapters. And that's a method that I've been keen on for quite a while now. And I find that it helps to pour energy into the stories, because Barbara, I'm a great fan of crime fiction. I read a lot of crime fiction from many different countries and many different periods. And the thing that can disappoint me in a book is where you have a great start and the finale doesn't live up to the opening premise. And that does happen quite a bit. And I'm very keen that the finale should be intriguing and unexpected, and give the reader some value for persevering. Because sometimes it's quite a slow burn in the Lake District stories, because I'm trying to develop the characters. I try to get soaked within the characters, so that whether it's Kingsley or Logan or Tori or whoever it may be, quite apart from Hannah and Daniel. So that takes a bit of build-up. So I'm asking the readers to bear with me whilst all the building blocks of the story are put in place. And there are things happening, but you're not necessarily, as a reader, understanding exactly where it's all going. That's certainly true of the Rachel Savanate books, I think, but it's also true to some extent of this book as well. I think that you're not, as a reader, generally sure what the story is going to turn into. And from a writer's point of view, I enjoy doing that. I like to think that even a seasoned crime reader will find something in there that maybe takes them aback, and that's certainly part of what I'm trying to do.
I had an interesting conversation with Solara Gentle, one of your co-authors, fellow authors rather,
Yeah.
not co-authors, about the fact legal training is a very useful thing when it comes to story structure and moving things forward and anticipating, because lawyers go what if all the time. We're trained to go, what if this happens, then this, and so forth. But you also remind me of, I've quoted this many times, Minette Walters and I once had this discussion, and her position is that the end has to be as good as the beginning, and how often it is that doesn't turn out. Yeah. But in this book, which is a bit of a departure, it isn't, especially with the man who walks into the lake and drowns himself, it's a why done it. His is a case of why did he do it? We know that he walked in and he died, but why did he do it? And we know that somebody disappeared, but again, we don't know, is it a why done it, or is it a who done it? Or is it a no one done it? It's so you do vary, your plots. Some of them are more straightforward, a murder investigation, but in this one, I think you let the whys take over. And since we've mentioned the Rachel Savernake series, I ought to mention the two titles. They're called Mortmain Hall and Gallows Court. Except I'm trying to remember, is it the reverse?
Well, Gallows Court was the first one.
Was the first one, and then Mortmain Hall, which is the really Gothic-y one. And you'll also be happy to know, Martin, that I've been having many discussions with Jana and Krantz and JT Ellison about the rise of the modern Gothic. So you were actually ahead of your time, but now the genre has caught up with you, and there is Gothic is becoming kind of a common reviewer in, reviewer parlance. They're always like buzzwords and so forth. Gothic is becoming one, and sometimes people confuse it with a locked room mystery, which is a completely different thing. Or they're always quoting Agatha Christie's and then there were none. And, that's a little bit different. Although the island is that remote structure that we're talking about, like
you've got
Anderley
the closed circle of suspects. So
you do in a Gothic, you do need the same enclosed environment that you need in a more straightforward Christie style mystery. But the other elements that come into play, including sometimes a tinge of the supernatural, are different. Horror is also making a comeback too, Martin, in the way, genre fiction goes up and it goes down and all the rest of it. But there's a resurgence of horror going on. So things are kind of blurring. And we could go all the way back to Walpole and talk about the Castle of Otranto if you want to, or we could talk about The Woman in White or whatever.
One of my favorites, The Woman in White.
It is, but I think, and also inspired by a real life event, I might add, the Wilkie Collins book. But anyway, Gallows Court and Mortmain Hall, for those of you who may not have run across those by Martin, are set in the 1930s, and indeed we do call them Golden Age. Well, Martin and I call them anyway, Golden Age Gothics, and they're terrific. But Martin also has written a lot of nonfiction, and he's the editor of the British Library Crime Classic series. We'll get to that, but I did not mention to you that Martin, who in retirement, is working harder than probably he ever did when he was actually practicing law, or maybe he's still practicing law on the side. Martin has filled so many roles over the last few years. He's been chairman of the Crime Writers Association. He's president of the Detection Club. He's done all kinds of review and anthology work and critical work and the whole bit. So let me just read you a little list of Martin's awards, because, here he is. So he's the 2020 Diamond Dagger winner, which is the highest award that the British Crime Writers Association can give. In America, the Mystery Writers of America call it a Grand Master. And I honestly don't know what that might be called in other award tiers. But anyway, the Diamond Dagger is a really cool thing. And you have what, a nifty little stick pin, because they won't let you actually take the dagger home.
Well, it's changed now. There is actually a dagger that they give you. So I've been presented with that. I was presented with it virtually, which was exciting enough by Anne Cleves. But there's actually going to be a live presentation at this year's dagger ceremony. So I actually get my hands on the Diamond Dagger.
Oh, wonderful. I've been there several times, and I can remember they come in with like security and, the Cartier, because Cartier provides the dagger. But, you might not be surprised the fact that they then take the dagger home and bring it back out the next year. He's also won a short story, was on the short story dagger shortlist for Strangers in the Pub. He won the Dagger in the Library in 2018 for the author whom library users particularly admire. So that's really fun. That's a kind of a reader's award. He's won the Poirot Award. This, again, more short story. He won an Edgar. I was there for that, for best biographical critical work for The Golden Age of Murder, which is a super book, and allies with his work in the British Library Crime Classics. He's won the Marjorie Allingham Prize. Is that a short story prize?
That's a short story competition, yeah.
Okay, Marjorie Allingham is a lesser known but wonderful member of that whole golden age crime. And I'm a big fan of, talk about Gothic. I mean, she had a couple of plots there that were absolutely super. She's probably best known for Tiger in the Smoke, which is really more of a police procedural. But I really loved, I can't remember the title. I really loved the one where there was the danger, the bad actor in the tower. What's the name of that one? And remember at the end, they actually go to the tower and you get to see who the bad actor is. And it does deliver. It's not a disappointment.
I'm not sure I know that one, Barbara. I've read quite a few Marjorie Allingans, but I don't know about that.
I'll have to look it up. Curses is Mr. Campion, right?
Yeah, Albert Campion.
Right, who has a fabulous family. Anyway, I met Marjorie Allingham once because she lived fairly long time. She's probably lived to be almost as old as I am now, but when I was much younger, I got to meet her. So, you know, he's also, don't I remember there's like a McCavity Award and other stuff? I don't think they caught everything.
Well, I have been fortunate, particularly in recent years, with awards, which is absolutely lovely and gratifying. It's of course, it's one of the nice things is to have survived so long as a writer, and I think that because I've had this other career as a lawyer, it has at least given me the chance to write the books I believed in, even when, other than yourself, there weren't so many people believing in them. And the early stories, Harry Devlin, for instance, the idea there was a gritty modern urban setting, but golden age plots. And that I was very enthusiastic about those books, and they did quite well. But the one issue is that none of the reviewers ever picked up on the golden age plot, because in the 1990s, the golden age was out of fashion. And it's only in more recent years that it's really come back with a vengeance. And that, for me, has been great. But it's also been very exciting as well to see all these wonderful old books coming back into print.
So the Golden Age of Murder, I think HarperCollins is the publisher of that, was a marvelous critical work that you wrote, kind of in the tradition of H.R.F. Keating, who was a friend of both of us and whom I really miss. And amazingly, his wife, Sheila, I'm corresponding with. I mean, she's still with us.
And she is, I think, I'm sure she won't mind me saying this, I think she's 95 now.
She is. She's an example of swimming to prolong your life. Sheila, in all the years that I have known her, that woman has been in the pool every day. I mean, as far as I can work out, rain or shine, wherever she is, just amazing.
She is fantastic. And
you're working on something a new. Before we get to the British Library Crime Classics, which I want to talk about, you have something new in the works. What is it?
It's just been published in Britain by HarperCollins. It will be published in the States in August, and it is called The Life of Crime. It's a very, very big book. It is 250,000 words about the history of crime fiction. And it was released just over a week ago. And the initial reaction has been fantastic. There have been national press reviews that have been very, very wonderful. So it's been many years in the making. And it's one of the reasons why I've not been writing so many Lake District books in recent years, because I've been writing about Rachel Sabanate, those novels. I've been working on this book, which has taken a very long time. But it's been great to combine the non-fiction with the fiction. I've really enjoyed that. And there have been times when I wondered whether I'd bitten off more than I could chew with the history of crime fiction all over the world. Finally, the book has seen the light of day. Although it is, as you can see, a very big book. 250,000 words for the history of crime fiction and taking in the international scene is, you know how many books there are, Barbara. I see it as a miracle of concision, really. So
thank God for computers. You know, you never would have been able to do this as a handwritten, hand-researched document.
have been impossible.
It would have been impossible. And don't you think, Martin, it's wonderful that a literary form that was basically British and American kind of in its origin has now migrated all around the world. So we're getting wonderful crime fiction from Japan and from, well, we all know about the Scandinavian crime fiction. The Australian crime fiction thing is really coming on strong. And I think it's wonderful that we're seeing it, homegrown in different countries and then translated so that more of us can read it. And that means that there's more work for translators as well, which is an exciting, additional thing. It's expensive. So not all publishers are willing to take on a book originally written in, let's say, Japanese, because it's expensive to hire a translator. But it's wonderful for authors who can then see their work migrating around the world. And, Mark, one of the great things about doing these Zoom things, Patrick and I talk about it a lot, is that we have this amazing international audience. It doesn't do us any good financially, although occasionally people order books. But I mean, Patrick was so electrified not long ago, and we got our first question from Mongolia. And we have a regular who lives in Italy and another one in Bucharest. And we did something or other where some guy in New Zealand was so worried he'd fall asleep that he sent his question in ahead of time because, and I think I love the fact that it's becoming this world community. So your book is perfect, because Zoom has given us a couple of years to kind of get more into that. I think that your book is coming out at just the right time.
I would certainly like to think so, Barbara, and I absolutely agree with what you've been saying. Before the pandemic, but not long before, I went to China. I went to Shanghai. I was guest at an exhibition, and I was absolutely blown away because the interest of the young Chinese people, and they were young. I'm not sure I met anybody over the age of 35, other than the authors. It was incredible.
Come on, Martin. When you're as old as we are, everybody looks like a teenager.
Well, believe it is driven by the universities, the mystery clubs in the university. It is, and they play these mystery games, which I and Paul Halter, the French lottery writer, and Soji Shimada, the Japanese lottery writer, we all participate in these incredibly convoluted mystery games. But it was an amazing experience, and to talk to these young people, students or people who have been students in the last few years, was absolutely incredible. And to see an exhibition of rare books that some of them have collected was incredible. An inscribed copy of Trent's Last Case, seeing it in Shanghai, quite incredible. John Dixon Carter, they're very keen on. And there is something about some of these more Gothic elements, and we're back to Gothic again, that very much resonates with these audiences and readerships in the Far East. And I'm not sure I've told you this, Barbara, but the Rachel books have been taken up in China and Japan and now Taiwan. Things I would never have expected in the last year or so. So that's been very exciting. I think with that series in particular, it's these Gothic elements that has appealed to the publishers in those particular countries.
Well, I can certainly see that. And there is a tinge of supernatural, a very heavy tinge in China and Chinese literature, but also in Japan, they're much more comfortable, with the kind of Greek idea of, spirits in the world all around us all the time. I've traveled there fairly extensively myself, and it's always fascinating to me, the little shrines. And, my absolute favorite example of that, which sort of obviates the supernatural, is I think we were in Vietnam anyway. We came up to a lovely temple, and outside it had an offering box. It said, "Pay money, become Buddha."
Brilliant.
It really was. It just, detracted from the more. And somewhere in Hong Kong, I can remember that Rob and I were taken up to a money tree, which completely fascinated me. I mean, it's this tree growing out of the concrete. In fact, it turns out to be an artificial tree. We finally worked out because there was no water source. And tied to it everywhere were, little offerings and money and so forth. But clearly, originally, it was a real tree. And the concept anyway. So
Yeah.
I can see the supernatural would work. And I also think the Japanese really like locked room mysteries. There's a
Well,
real bond with them in,
yeah,
the
and
John Hickman car.
I think it's not just the supernatural. I think it because there isn't really supernatural stuff in my books. But I think that melodrama,
Mm.
as long as it's not over the top, I think that can work very well in a crime novel
Yeah,
anyway.
but there's also a real history of ghosts in Chinese literature
Yes,
too.
yeah,
Lisa
yes, there
Steve
is.
writes
There
about
is
that.
the spirits and so
Yeah.
on. Yeah, Judge D and so on. That's right. That strand of mystery. But as I say, I think the melodrama too is a factor, and when you get the that pace developing in the later stages of the story as things move to a dramatic conclusion, I think that's appealing to these audiences in the Far East. I think that's why these books have taken off there.
Here's a fact I learned in Xi'an that you might not have ever run across. We were on the edge of the Silk Road, and the guide asked us if we knew why there are moon gates. Why are there the round doors with the sill? So we're all thinking it's astronomy, right? That people are looking up and seeing the moon the whole bit. Do you know the point of the moon gate is that ghosts can't step over the raised sill.
Right.
So a moon gate is basically a ghost catcher. That
Right.
really, really, I thought sort of summed it up. And Xi'an's an interesting place because it is the gateway to the Silk Road. And there was I'm trying to remember, but there was either a synagogue or it was all together. There was like a temple and a synagogue and a mosque and the whole 9 yards there. So, it's a very, the cultures had all kind of combined, but they're clearly comfortable with the idea, of ghosts in the real world and the whole bit. Let's talk about the British Library Crime Classics because it's an amazing series. You've been the series editor from the beginning, is that right?
The consultant, not quite at the beginning. That there were a few that they did 3 Victorian books, which were good books, but didn't particularly do very much. And then there were 3 books by a writer called Mavis Doriel Hay that they tried, and I actually met the editor, a young man called Rob Davis, a wonderful guy, who I had a coffee with him to talk about something else. And he told me that he'd come in and he decided to relaunch the series with new cover artwork. And he's going to use these 1930s vintage railway poster.
Just a brilliant decision.
Brilliant concept. And the British Library owns these images, so that was fine. It didn't cost them any money. And he said he was going to do a couple. And would I like to write the introductions? The Cornish Coast Murder by John Bude and another one called The Lake District Murder. And so I wrote these introductions. I'd written introductions for other publishers previously, and I sent them off and didn't think much about it. And then he contacted me to say very excitedly that the sales had suddenly gone up through the roof. And yeah, it'd be nice to think it was these wonderful introductions, but it was the covers that were really selling the books to booksellers.
Absolutely.
And once people were tempted, once that they saw the books in the shops, and once they were tempted by the covers, that this is the genius of it, they would start to read the stories and they would think, well, actually, I might never have heard of this author who's been out of print for 70 or 80 years. But actually, this is a fun reading experience. And that has been the story, I think, that people have been able to make discoveries. And now the series, it's just passed it in Britain, just had the 100th book in the series, which is incredible, going at 1 a month for a long time now. And including the anthologies that I edit on, themed anthologies. And they're still selling as well as ever. And that's quite remarkable. But I think one of the reasons for that is that we've been keen, and I've been very keen, to encourage this although I don't take the final decisions, of course, it's the British Library who do that. But I've been very keen that this series should showcase the whole range of detective fiction over the decades, from the 30s to the 60s. Different styles, different authors, some better known, some totally obscure. So you've got a whole set of really kind of microcosm of detective fiction as a whole. And so it's not a question of trying to do the same thing all the time, just as I don't like with my own books to do the same thing all the time. I like to vary it so that the reality is that with the British Library series, for instance, as no doubt with my books, some readers will like some more than others. But the idea is that over a period of time, there's enough there to give plenty of enjoyment to a whole lot of people. And that, I believe, is the key to success and longevity, to have that variety and keep people wondering what's coming next. It's not just the same old, even though these are old books, but they're repackaged, but they're introducing 21st century readers to a whole lot of writers who just totally gone off the radar screen, which is...
Well, and it's interesting because I remember how much I liked The Spoilt Killed by Mary Kelly, which actually beat out John le Carré for a gold dagger. I mean, so at the time, it wasn't obscure. It was a very big book, but she didn't write enough, and she wasn't, various factors. So these are not the Agatha Christie, Dorothy Sayers, Josephine Tey, Marjorie Allingham, who've been kept in print. But these are, I don't even want to call them lower level, but these are just authors who, for one reason or another, never broke through to that kind of superstardom. And as Martin says, they are very varied. That's a great thing. They are varied in their content. They also range all over the landscape so that people can, you get one set on a farm, you get one set, in Mary Kelly's case, you're in the potteries up in the north of England, and that's a fascinating thing. And those are the novels. But what Martin also does is their short story collections. Now, do you put those together for the British Library? Because those are different than the novels that the British Library, I should tell you, like the Library of Congress, is a depository library, right?
Yeah.
So the reason they have all this stuff is because when you publish a book in Britain, you're required, or the publisher is required to deposit a copy in basically the Copyright Office, whatever. Here in the Library of Congress is the Copyright Office where that takes in, and you'll be happy to know, I just love this. It's a complete aside, but we do the events for Preston and Child in their massive best-selling Pendergast series, and they had the idea of, instead of doing some kind of a sticker or whatever it is, that they would have the publisher who agreed to create a playing card set so that the main characters, Agent Pendergast and two others, would come in like a baseball card set, right? So that's really cool, and everybody loved it. But one day, because I used to be a librarian at the Library of Congress, one day I got a letter from the woman in the Copyright Office, and she said, "We collect trading cards," she said, "and so we would like to have a copy of the trading cards as well as for the copy of the book. And in fact, if you could send us two, says we get two books, because that's what the publisher deposits, then we would have the trading cards, for each book." So now we have a whole thing going with the library where, the publisher is sending them a book and we're sending them, whatever ephemera, as the book probably, which I think is wonderful. And the publishers have really gotten into this. I just got Simon & Schuster just created a piece for us for the 20th Brad Thor book, Scott Harbath and all. And so there's like a whole new collector train going on here.
Wow.
But
Well,
your point that the British Library owns the posters.
Yeah.
Because I think, despite the content in your marvelous work and all, I think the packaging is what really sells that series. I will never forget walking down Piccadilly and strolling into Hatchard's whenever, I remember how many years ago it was, and there was a giant table, and the entire table was covered with the British Library crime classics, and it was a knockout, Martin. It just blew you away looking at these wonderful posters. And so I find it interesting that there are enough of them that I don't think so far they've had to repeat any of the covers. I mean, the
No,
posters on the covers.
they have had some original artwork done. They've commissioned a few.
Oh, you have?
Yeah, for some books where it wasn't possible to find an image that worked. Although they take a pretty liberal view of these things. So there have been a few of those, but it's predominantly based on the railway posters, that's for sure.
Well, they are just superb, and the coordination between the content or the theme of the book and the theme of the art has been very, very good. So when you go about, I mean, you write introductions for the novels, but when you go about doing, because the June book is a menagerie. What's the title of it?
Guilty Creatures. Guilty Creatures.
Guilty Creatures, and basically it's stories that have what, an animal at the heart?
Yeah, yes, it's the animal kingdom, the menagerie of mystery. That what I do is I suggest themes to the British Library, and if they and I will suggest a number of stories, and if they like the idea, and if they can think of a cover and all that kind of thing, then they will ask me to come up with a detailed proposal. And so I'll do more research and find stories, and people make suggestions to me. There are people I consult, experts I consult in Britain. One way or another, I will come up with a variety of stories from a variety of periods between the 20s and the 70s, which reflect the theme, sometimes very directly, sometimes very marginally, to be honest. But again, with anthologies, and as you know, Barbara, I've put together a lot of anthologies of different kinds over the years. I take the view that with an anthology of short stories, which I do love, you mentioned before that I write a lot of short stories. I love that, and I love reading them. But I think with an anthology, it is inevitable that you won't like every story equally. That's a given. That's a given. You have to accept that. The idea I have is to try to put together a book that will have some stories that will appeal to a very wide range of tastes, and introduce readers who may not be familiar with a particular author or a particular style of writing to something that they wouldn't otherwise have tried if it was a novel. But if it's slipped into an anthology, it's what Harry Keating used to call the Mickey Finn, that they will try that. Yeah, I quite like that. So they might explore that author. And I think that's one of the great merits of anthologies, that you can do that and have a variety of length, of style, of subject matter, as well as of who's written the story. So the anthologies, I suggested to Rob Davis originally a couple of ideas: a London anthology, Capital Crimes, and Country House Mysteries, and I think we're now up to number 18, which is amazing and hugely enjoyable to do.
Well, it is. Let's call Patrick up, because Patrick himself is actually a distinguished anthologizer. He's edited at least 2. Are there more, Patrick, besides the 2 that I know?
No, just 2. Just 2.
But Patrick, one of his short stories won the Edgar for best short story was in Phoenix Noir, wasn't it? Louis Salvatore Uria. I was at the Edgars when he won it, and it was just so exciting.
Really? Yeah.
So what do you say about anthologies, Patrick, as somebody who's also put them together?
I really love the whole, because you're as Martin was just saying, you're creating a narrative. And so it's kind of interesting to put to the arranging the pieces. You're taking the reader on a journey. And sometimes you can tell if, well, this isn't quite right, this one here, and length and tone and, kind of, dark tone, lighter tone, that sort of thing. It's almost like, do you remember Martin making those old cassette mixtapes? Yeah, it was kind of like that. I really like anthologies. I like ones that have a specific sort of interesting unifying theme.
Yeah.
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 Well,
I'd like
Martin's
to
done it
pitch
more
another.
by subject. Akashic in this country has done a remarkable series. They call them Urban Noir. And,
Right.
you know, they've gone around to cities, and maybe they've expanded their definition of urban to some degree. So the theme is, you know, the stories will be like all set in Paris or Cape Town or Detroit or whatever it is. And indeed, you've also done a couple of very well-received holiday themed collections.
Yeah.
Christmas Crimes, I think. And
the Christmas ones have done incredibly well.
yeah.
There was also one called Resorting to Murder, which was a kind of more of a seaside holiday anthology. So yeah, but the Crimson Snow and Silent Nights, the first two of the Christmas anthologies, have sold many tens of thousands of copies in Britain, which has been incredible. And so, yeah, I've never had that with other anthologies, but the Christmas ones have done phenomenally well.
So let me say that the British Library Crime Classics then inspired my husband, Robert, and myself before we sold Poison Pen Press to go to the Library of Congress, which we've already mentioned in this conversation, and propose to them that they do a Library of Congress Crime Classics series. And your distinguished colleague, Leslie S. Klinger, amazingly enough, another lawyer. There's got to be something, you know, about that. But anyway, Leslie is the editor of the British Library Crime Classics. The Library of Congress Crime Classics. And I think he said there's one coming out every 2 months this year. And so they too are ranging around. Some are short story collections, some are full novels. And he's trying to, you know, kind of cover a much broader range, I might add, I think, than your Golden Age.
He's doing horror too, right, Barbara?
What, honey?
Isn't he doing some horror classics as well?
He has been doing the Haunted Library. I don't know how well that has done, but, you know, if the publisher holds on to it because of this rise in the Gothic and horror, I myself think that it just got a little ahead of its moment. But you know, it's always a thing. You know, do you want to be in the van leading, or do you want to be behind catching up? And you know, Dan Brown wrote the Da Vinci Code, and that was a leader. But then I don't even remember how many religious conspiracy thrillers. God, there were hundreds of them that followed after until everybody got sick of them. And then, you know, we went off into Twilight and whatever all that was about. And that's just the way publishing and it goes in tropes. You know, we're still not done with Gone Girl, right? I mean, that was 2012 and it's been 10 years. And we're still into that whole unreliable narrator, domestic, whatever it all is, waiting for whatever the next big thing is. And I think the Gothic, to some degree, Martin and Patrick, kind of grows out of Gone Girl. Don't you think it helps sort of seed the way with the idea of unreliability and, you know, closeted suspense and all that sort of thing?
And Gillian Flynn is a big fan of Wilkie Collins and the sensation novels of the 1860s. So, and of course, Collins was very influenced by the Gothic. So that's one of the strands there for sure.
Well, we're all waiting breathlessly for the next big thing. I think it's the Gothic at the moment, but somewhere we can't quite see it yet. There is going to be somebody that's going to write.
Speak to something that's in the air that people are.
It's going to be, there's going to be that big book right out there, and then everybody's going to go, oh, look, yeah, there we go. But I like the fact that, you know, the Crime Classic series, both national libraries, which I think is really cool, the British Library and the Library of Congress, are reminding readers new to the genre or seasoned readers who either never met those authors or have forgotten them and all, is keeping that going. So the Golden Age is not resting just in the vaults of HarperCollins, because they were the big publisher for so much of that, the Collins Crime Club, A Christie for Christmas, you know, all that stuff. I just think it's marvelous. And Patrick and I have noticed that the classic section of the Poison Pen, which, you know, went nowhere for forever, is now one of our fastest turning sections. Do you see that, Patrick? I mean,
I do, yeah.
Every week when I do a restock report, we have a whole thing, and the classic section goes on for pages, you know, and it's not just crime. I mean, it's, you know, it's The Great Gatsby and Kurt Vonnegut and, you know, a lot of different authors, but there seems to have been, and I think the pandemic accelerated it, a return to, kind of the roots of various literature, a rediscovery, or for many people, a discovery of really great works that,
There's something comforting about it too.
The what, Patrick?
I was just going to say, perhaps there's something comforting about the classics, about going back into the, sifting through the. But I have a question.
Already happened, right? So we're more secure.
I have a question for Martin regarding the Lake District. Being a recovering English major,
No, you're not.
Never been to the Lake District, but I've read about Nether Stowey and of course Tintern Abbey and all that whole area. I'd love to get over there. Is it still? Do the little towns and areas, are they keeping the area small and idyllic, and or is it being developed and changing much?
I think that in the Lake District itself, it's very well preserved, and because it's a national park, there are rules about development. So that isn't so much of a worry. There is a worry, which is that there are a lot of second homes. So a lot of people who live somewhere else buy up homes, so local people can't afford to buy the houses in these pretty little villages. So that's an issue. And in fact, the idea of the pressures on rural English society is one of the background themes in the whole of my Lake District series, because that is something that interests me. It's not at the forefront of these novels, but it's there in nearly all of them, really. But including the Girl They All Forgot. But the Lake District, when you take somebody there who's not been there before, they are very often excited to find that it is much as they had dreamed it is. It's not lost the character that has appealed to people for generations. I think that's fair to say. So
Wordsworth and daffodils and all that great stuff.
Yeah, right? Absolutely.
Yeah.
De Quincey.
Yeah. Opium eater.
yeah. So there's a lot of history there, a lot of literary heritage apart from other types of history, as well as the wonderful geography. So there's a lot going on there, and it's fascinating. And although the main spots like Windermere are very, very busy and well visited, you don't have to go many miles and you're out on your own. That's one of the striking things to this day. But maybe it's those narrow roads that deter people, but you can soon find yourself on your own, and that's fascinating.
Right. It's a great hiking country, that's for sure.
How far is it from London? I mean, I could check a map, but is it a couple hours away?
Well, on the train, it's probably about 3 hours away. There is the main line that goes from Euston Station that stops at Oxenholme Station, which is in the Lake District, and that's about 3 hours. It's about an hour further north from here.
Right.
So not too bad.
Not too bad.
Driving is a short distance, but takes forever because of the nature of the roads and the volume of the traffic. I always remind people you could put the entire British Isle in Arizona, and but you can't. We could drive. Believe me, we can drive to Flagstaff and the North Rim of the Grand Canyon a lot faster than you could drive from London to the Lake District. It just
believe me, yeah.
Yep, it's a whole different thing. You have to.
It is.
You have to allow for all of that.
I had the same thing in Ireland. These big lurching tour buses. It's terrifying on these tiny little 2-lane roads and sheep.
And then there are roadworks. There are roadworks everywhere. I mean, I think it's a worldwide plague, but because a lot of these roads are so small and, they get beat up all the time, and the whole bit that roadworks is, I mean, if you're a driver in England, your heart just sinks when you see the ghastly roadwork sign. It's even worse on the motorway because you can get caught in a tailback that could catch you for hours. I have sat outside Birmingham, I think once for like 5 hours. I couldn't believe it. Well, we digress. Anyway, Martin, it's been absolutely wonderful to talk to you about The Girl They All Forgot. I'm so happy that it finally has appeared. And I guess my final question for you would be, what novel are you working on next?
The next novel to be published will be Blackstone Fell, which is another Rachel Savanagh. That's number 3. And I'm working on the 4th one right now, which is called Sepulchre Street. And I'm about halfway through the first draft of that. So keeping busy.
Wonderful. Well, that's really good news. Anyway, you can certainly read The Girl They All Forgot all by itself without having read any of the Lake District mysteries. But if you do and you fall in love, then you can go all the way back to the Coffin Trail and read your way forward, which I recommend because the whole development of the characters and so forth is marvelous to behold. So Martin, thank you. And thank you for being brave enough to do a live event. This is the first one where I didn't even tell you we were going to do that because I was afraid you'd balk. So anyway, see, it hasn't been that painful, has it?
It's been lovely. It's been great to talk to you and great to chat with you as well, Patrick. Thanks.
You too.
Right. Patrick always adds so much to the whole thing. So maybe next time it'll be you and Patrick and you can just anthologize. It'll be great. Anyway, thank you all very much for joining us and enjoy the rest of your afternoon or evening if you're in England. Bye.